So I'm Kathleen Pate. I am the education specialist at the Clinton Presidential Library. And today we're going to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is the Constitution and specifically amendments to the Constitution. And I have a theory and I want to see if my evidence adds up. And so we're going to go through this together. And at the end, you decide if my theory if you think that I provided sufficient evidence to support my hypothesis. So I'm not going to tell you what it is until the end, because I just want to do a quick review of the amendments to the Constitution. So we know the Constitution was written after the states decided that the Articles of Confederation were not working. And so one of the ways they were able to get the Constitution in place was to promise the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, which, interestingly enough, were actually originally going to be 12 amendments to the Constitution. I don't want to go that direction right now because I want to keep this program moving, but it's something to look up later, and I'll share some good links for that. So, what do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? Can you tell me in the chat? What do we call the first 10 amendments to the Constitution? Does anybody know? The Bill of Rights. Tanya got it. Yes, they're flooding in now. Somebody mentioned the preamble, which is the beginning of the Constitution that tells us the mission statement for the Constitution. But the Bill of Rights, that's what we call the first 10 amendments. We're going to talk about those, and I've grouped them together because I want to first think about 1 through 3. Now, Teresa, I want to make sure my slide is not cutting off. Can you see all of that language for the first 3 amendments to the Constitution?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Excellent. So let's just take a moment and read these, and it would be awesome if someone could take one and put it in words that you might use today, right? One of the challenges about looking at the Constitution, looking at the amendments, is they use words in a different way. They use antiquated words that we don't use anymore. I can't remember the last time I said thereof. That's not something I normally say, but looking at that First Amendment, what would be shorthand for that First Amendment? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. I could make that 3 words. Freedom of expression, absolutely. This whole sentence together is freedom of religion, freedom of speech, including the press, the right of people to assemble, and the right of people to, we very rarely say a redress of grievances. I might start using that again. Looking at Amendment 2 is something that's in the news a lot, right? How's the Supreme Court interpreting Amendment 2, the right to own guns? Yes, is that what that means, that individuals have the right to own guns? And then Amendment 3 doesn't get a lot of discussion, because it hasn't happened since when? I want you to look at these 3 amendments. What happened in U.S. history prior to the writing of the Constitution that would make these 3 be the top 3 amendments, the first amendments? Because I contend there's the Revolutionary War, absolutely, right? So as the colonists began to grow frustrated, taxation without representation, these things were happening, right? King George was limiting freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom to assemble, right? He was also limiting access to arms, and he was also, they were putting British soldiers in people's homes, right? No, not asking, they were just saying, these soldiers are now going to live in your home, right? So the people of the United States, the leaders, were very concerned about those things happening again. They wanted to specifically prohibit them. All right, so moving on to our next group, and I appreciate all the chat. That way I know that we're interacting. Okay, I'm going to put actually the next 5 amendments together. 6 amendments. We'll see. Amendment 4. Does anybody know? I want you to look at Amendment 4. So take a picture with your mind. Look at Amendment 5. Take a picture with your mind. 6. Take a picture with your mind and ignore that little red line. It thinks I've misspelled defense, but that is an antiquated spelling. And then look at 7 and 8. All right, so let's go. Why don't we go backwards, because these later ones are shorter, so probably easier to remember. So if you were going to rephrase Amendment 8 or Amendment 7, so shortening those to something that uses words that like we use today. Have you ever heard that we have a right to a jury trial, a trial by our peers? Does anyone watch Law and Order? Yes, and so excessive bail shall not be required is number 8, nor excessive fines, nor cruel and unusual punishment. So if you look at 8, 7, going backwards to 6, that is your right to a speedy trial. 5 has the rule of double jeopardy, right? You can't be charged with the same offense twice. And unreasonable search and seizure, right? The police cannot just come in your house, start going through the trunk of your car. You have to have a warrant, right? And there's a lot of interesting Supreme Court cases related to Amendment 4. So what constitutes an unreasonable search and seizure? But you see all of these, so 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 all relate to how citizens are going to be treated within the justice system, right? So these were also things that the founders were concerned about. So concerned about individual liberties, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, but also setting up amendments to the Constitution that really spell out how the courts will act to make them fair and just. So we're getting a sense of things that were important to the founders, right? And that had to be added to the Constitution. And so we refer to those as the Bill of Rights. They were passed as a package in 1791. And if you look at 9 and 10, which is where we are now, these limit the power of the federal government. And these are subject to a lot of interpretation. kind of like search and seizure or the right to bear arms. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. And then 10 says anything that's not specifically in the Constitution, those rights, those powers are reserved to the states, right? So this was addressing that tension between the federal government and the state government. So this year, right now, 2020, it's time to get out your calculator, or those of you who can do math in your head. How many years ago was the Bill of Rights passed? Now, we're not going to worry about the fact that it was passed December 15th, 1791. You're just going to take 2020. I'm going to write on my scratch pad. 229. Perfect. I don't even have to do the math. Great. That's why we call this session, You Do the Math. Okay, so 229 years ago, the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, ratified by the states. Since then, we've only changed the Constitution 17 times. So the total number of amendments, super easy. 10 amendments, 27, right? There are 27 amendments total. So in the last 229 years, we've only changed the Constitution 17 times. Since the Bill of Rights was passed, we've only changed the Constitution 17 times. But part of my argument is that the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment should not count. Does anyone agree with that argument? If you do, tell me so. Why do you think I would argue that we wouldn't count the 18th Amendment and the 21st Amendment? The 21st, yes. All right. So the 21st Amendment was the repeal of Prohibition, which undid, yes, they cancel each other out, but they are still amendments. Yes, but in my mind, if we change the Constitution and then we unchanged it, we've really only changed the Constitution 15 times, right? And you can agree with my interpretation or not agree with my interpretation. All right, so we don't see a lot of amendments passed. They tend to come in clumps, right? So after the first
Kathleen, we're having trouble hearing you.
All right.
Can you hear
All right. Therese, can you see my screen and hear me?
I can see your screen and hear you now, yes.
Okay. I think we're back in business.
Okay.
All right.
Perfect.
Screen and hear me? All right. All right. So 4 years after the Bill of Rights is passed, we get another amendment, and then 9 years after that, so 13 years later, we get another amendment. And the amendments start getting longer and crazier. Well, Amendment 11 is not longer crazy. Judicial power shall not be construed to extend in any suit, blah, 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 blah. So Amendment 12 is super long. And I wonder if anyone knows exactly what it means. It has to do with how we elect the president, and the vice president. And this sets up something. The thing is too small to read. It is very small. Don't worry, the rest of them are going to be bigger. And the ones before were bigger. This amendment is just super long, so the whole thing on one page. Right. So basically, it sets up the Electoral College. Right. So then I'm so very sorry.
We're struggling to hear you, Kathleen. You're kind of breaking up as you're talking.
Okay, I'm getting a lot of just all right. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm so sorry. The sound is better.
Oh, you're breaking up again.
Yeah, I'm not sure what I can do to make it better. We have sometimes the internet where I live is not the best.
Have you turned off your video, Kathleen?
I did
Okay.
in hopes of making it, yeah,
Well,
in
we're
hopes of
hearing you.
taxing the system less.
Yes, we're hearing you a little bit better now, so maybe just talk slowly.
Okay, because I'm getting a bunch of feedback on my end, and I'm not sure where that's coming from.
We can't hear any feedback. We can just hear you.
Okay. So, where were we? We were about to go to the next set of amendments. And the next set of amendments are the 13th, 14th amendments. And those amendments were tied together. They were passed in the period at the end of the. So does anyone know what 13th, 14th, and 15th amendments are? All right, so 13th Amendment abolished slavery. Absolutely. And then 14 and 15 also relate to African Americans. Right? And the 14th Amendment is actually going to be critical later in the 1960s. The 14th Amendment, Ryan, you're getting close. The 14th Amendment is about guaranteeing rights and liberties to former slaves. And then the 15th, Emma got it. That's a nice, concise answer. 13 abolishes slavery, 14 guarantees rights and liberties, and she's just summed that up in one word, equal. And then the 15th Amendment gives African American men the right to vote, right? It says that the right to vote shall not be abridged based on race. Okay. So that's important. I want you to remember the 15th Amendment in the back of your head. That is not spelled right. All right. The 16th Amendment establishes, right, well, only the men. The 16th Amendment establishes income tax. The 17th Amendment does away with indirect election of U.S. senators. So I want you to keep that in mind along with the 15th. And while we're at it, I want you to keep in mind 12th Amendment. as well, because that has to do with the election of the president and vice president. All right, so let's skip ahead to the one that I don't count. 18 and 21. Right, so for 14 years in our nation, the prohibition, alcohol, the production and distribution of alcohol was prohibited. So I don't count those, which is how I get to 17 amendments over the last 229 years. But in between the 18th and the 21st, we have 2 amendments. The 19th being my all-time favorite. Why would you think the 19th? Yes, women can vote. Now, the interesting thing about the 19th Amendment is it was not applied universally, right? So there were still impediments to voting, right? There were still things that prevented people from voting. Age, having to pay a poll tax. So there are some other amendments to the Constitution that are going to come up later. The 20th Amendment changes the dates on when a new Congress is seated. Yes, grandfather clause, spelled a little bit differently. There were issues of race, absolutely. So there were still ways that African-American men were being prevented from voting. African-American women were being prevented from voting. Native Americans were not considered citizens at this point, so they could not vote. So there were there were laws, there were obstacles, there were things called Jim Crow laws. But I do want to point out the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, 70 years after the 15th Amendment. Wait, no, 50 years. This is why you need to do the math. Right, 50 years after the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment was ratified. So the 20th Amendment also relates to elected officials. When Congress will start, when the president will take the oath of office. All right, and you see we've got a gap there again. We've got a pretty large gap. We're moving from 1933 all the way to 1951. Why was the 22nd Amendment added to the Constitution? It had been kind of a tradition that presidents would only serve 2 terms. Which president broke that tradition? He ended up serving 4, well, 3.5. Yes, he was elected to 4. Yes, FDR. And so the 22nd Amendment established that no president shall not be elected more than twice. So you could actually serve more than 2 terms. If you were vice president, you became president and then were elected on your own twice. Now, what's the significance of the 23rd Amendment? The way I remember this is 23 DC. Prior to the addition of the 23rd Amendment to the Constitution, residents of the District of Columbia could not vote. Right, Will, you're absolutely right. So that allows residents of DC to vote. All right, we talked about poll tax being one of the obstacles for people being able to vote, and the 24th Amendment outlawed poll tax or other taxes to limit voting. But there are other ways that African Americans were prevented from voting, right? We see the 24th Amendment is passed in 1964. What is the popular vote? Okay, so the 24th Amendment prohibits a poll tax, passed in 1964, but then the Voting Rights Act, which is not an amendment to the Constitution, it's a law that was passed in 1965, prohibits other kinds of voter suppression, such as literacy tests and other things that were being used primarily in the South. Yes, blacks had to guess the amount of marbles in a jar to vote, the number of this, I'm not making this up, the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. So impossible literacy tests. So the 24th Amendment to the Constitution specifically prohibits poll tax. You cannot charge someone a tax, a fee, to be able to vote. And then the 1965 Voting Rights Act takes that a step further and specifically outlaws some other voter suppression techniques. The 25th Amendment establishes a clearer line of succession to the presidency. So what happened in the 1960s that would make Congress want to amend the Constitution so that it was clearer if the JFK assassination? Absolutely. Absolutely. So that's 1963, right? So the 25th Amendment. So I'm making notes about which amendments relate to different topics and themes. All right, and we're getting close to the end of the amendments, right? There are only 27 or 25 if you buy my argument. 26th Amendment was passed in 1971, and it lowered the voting age to 18. Why do you think there was a big push to lower the voting age to 18? What was going on in the late 60s war? Yes. So you could be 18 years old and be sent to fight in Vietnam and not be able to vote. Right? So the voting age was lowered to 18. So 27th Amendment is actually, 27th Amendment is really interesting because 27th Amendment was proposed, we've kind of come full circle in talking about the amendments. The 27th Amendment was proposed with the Bill of Rights. Originally, the Bill of Rights had 12 amendments. And one of them was you can't give yourself a pay raise. So the original voting age was 21. It was 21 before the 26th Amendment was passed, and it was lowered to 18. All right, so I want to think about some math now, and this is where you guys come in. How many amendments do you think relate directly to voting? If you were going to make an argument that voting is the most important thing in our country, Okay, so I've got 5, and I've got someone who says all of them. I've got 3. I could be convinced, depending on how you interpret the Constitution, at a minimum, I would say 5. And let me know if you agree with me or not. The 5 that I'm saying relate directly to voting are going to be the 15th Amendment, which prohibits discrimination based on race. Yes, well, you could say that most of them do, right? So I'm going to say at a minimum 5. So I'm saying the 15th Amendment, 19th Amendment, we're commemorating the centennial of the 19th Amendment. That's 50 years after the 15th Amendment. And it doesn't guarantee women the right to vote. It says you can't deny it or abridge it. And then 23rd Amendment. I gave you guys a trick to remember what the 23rd Amendment is. 23 is DC, right? So 15th, 19th, 23. I'm going to say the 24th, the abolition of the poll tax, right? It's specifically related to voting. The way I remember 24 is to say 24 no more poll tax. And then last but not least, it's still on the screen, the 26th Amendment lowers the voting age. So there's 5 amendments out of 15 that directly relate to voting. But then I've got a question. What about 17? Direct election of senators. Do y'all want to add that to the list? Do y'all want to make it 6? 6 out of 15? How do you feel about the 12th Amendment? Let's go back in case you weren't able to memorize it. The 12th Amendment is talking about the election of president and vice president and how that's going to work. And if you look at this, and I know it's very small for y'all, but at the bottom, there's an asterisk because part of this was changed, right? Representatives shall not choose a president whenever the right of choice shall devolve upon them before the 4th day of March following. Then the vice president shall act as president, as in case of the death or other constitutional designated president. Right? So do y'all agree that 12 could be interpreted as related to voting? If we say voting rights, but also how elections are run. Okay, so you're giving me a thumbs up on the 12th and the 17th. How do you feel about the 20th? The 20th is what changes the 12th, right? It gives us some more guidance. Have I lost the 20th Amendment? No, there it is. Changes the dates. So it modifies that from March. Okay, so are y'all giving me, isn't voting freedom of speech? Without freedom of speech, we couldn't vote either. That's one way of interpreting it. You could add in, but I'm really focused on the 27 that happened after. Okay, so you're giving me 20. What about 22? How do you feel about 22? The term limits. Do you feel like that directly relates to voting? No. Rowan says no. Klaus says no. Y'all don't want to give me, okay, we're gonna skip over the 22nd. How do you feel about the 25th the clearer line to succession to the presidency. Do you want to count that as related to voting or no? Okay, the quicker typers are getting, okay, it looks like I'm getting majority no on that. So even if we don't count the 22nd and the 25th, that gives us 5, 6, 7, 8. You don't vote if the president dies. Okay, so if we ignore those about presidential succession, that leaves us with, so we said 27 minus 10 is 17. I don't count the 18th and the 21st because they cancel each other out. So that leaves 15 amendments over the course of 229 years. The 18th and the 21st are the ones that cancel each other out. So we have to find 8 amendments that relate directly or indirectly, and yes, that is more than half. So what is the conclusion that you can draw from that based on the amendments to the Constitution? What is the thing? Yeah, well, I'm not counting one in the total of the 15 because I put the 10 in the Bill of Rights. But even without one, we have a clear majority of amendments that relate directly or indirectly to voting. So what do we think the most important thing, based on the Constitution and the Constitution alone, what do we think the most important thing, the most important action as a citizen that we can do? What do we think that is? Voting rights. Absolutely. If you look at the Constitution, specifically at the amendments, a majority of those work to ensure, enhance, or expand voting rights. So I hope that the sound got a little bit better. I was getting less interference, so I'm hoping that you were getting less interference as well. I want to open up the floor to questions. We listed this program at 45 minutes, so it looks like we have about 5 or 6 minutes. Oh, good, the sound did get better. I was getting a lot less interference. Earlier, it felt like it sounded like a truck was driving through my living room. All right, does anyone have any questions, thoughts? I do want to mention that part of the reason that I did this session today is that tomorrow is the centennial, it's the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment being added to the Constitution. So this was a really big deal, right? There were states where women could vote. There were states that women could vote in all elections. There were states where women could only vote in local elections or primary elections. And 72 years after starting that fight, women were given the right to vote. And I don't actually like to use the word given or that they won. They fought for the right, right? It wasn't something that was given to them. They earned it in so many ways. All right, any questions? Why did they say women couldn't vote? Well, people made different arguments about women voting. One of the things that they said is that women were wholesome and good and pure, and that politics was not, and so women should not be sullied. Some people thought that women were not as smart as men, didn't need to be a part of important decision making. Right? So there were a lot of reasons that people opposed women's suffrage. But as is required to add an amendment to the Constitution, 3/4 of the states, right? So there were 48 states at the time. 3/4 of the states would be 36. 36 states ratified the 19th Amendment. Tennessee being the 36th state, which they did August 18th, 1920. And things took a little bit longer then, so the amendment was not added to the Constitution until August 26th, 1920, 100 years ago tomorrow. So, some of you are not yet voting age, but I want you to keep this in mind. When you are 18, thank you to the 26th Amendment, when you are 18, you not only have a right, you have a responsibility to register, to vote, to hold your elected officials accountable. This is the premise on which our democracy is based. So if there are no further questions, I think I'll turn it back over to Therese. Do you have anything to add as we wrap up?
No, just to thank you for your time today and for sharing all of your information. And thank you everybody who joined. We appreciate it. We have more sessions coming up in the next few months, so feel free to check those out as well. But hope everybody has a great afternoon.
Yes. Thank you so much for participating, Therese. Thank you for hosting.
Absolutely. Bye, everybody.
Bye.